Hi, I'm Ken Record, and this is Mining Biblical Truth. I'm really excited this week to be back with you to talk about the fabulous small book of Ruth. And I'm titling this talk, Faithfulness and Redemption. Now, if you prefer to view or download the content of this talk at higher quality resolution, please go to our website, www.biblemining.org, and click on Downloads at the top of the page, and then choose Judges-Ruth from the drop-down menu. And you'll find PDFs of all the slides from this talk, from the Judges talk of last week, and also separately from this talk on Ruth. Unlike usual, I am going to be showing fewer slides in this talk, but I want to assure you that you won't miss anything if you choose the PDF version instead, because everything that I'm going to say verbally without the slides is contained in the slides in the PDF. So, Book of Ruth, and emphasize three Hebrew words: Debak, Goel, and Hesed. And in terms of attributes of God, God never speaks in the book of Ruth, either directly or through a prophet, and little reference is made to God by the narrator, and yet we see God's invisible hand at work. So our aim here is to learn that God is faithful to redeem his people. God's word has been recorded from many human perspectives. One of those is the feminine perspective, best displayed in the books of Ruth and Esther. Christopher Walken, in his book Critical Biblical Theory, compares God's word to a great cathedral, where Ruth and Esther are like side chapels. In the darkness of the period of the Judges that we talked about last week, the book of Ruth sheds the light of God's faithfulness. Now let's look at the chiastic structure of the book. In the center, we have the meeting of Ruth and Boaz in chapter 2, 1 through 23. This is flanked on either side by, it's preceded by return to Bethlehem and emptiness and hopelessness, and explores the identity question, is this Naomi? And Naomi left full and returns empty. It's followed by Ruth appeals to Boaz and returns in fullness and hope. And the identity question is asked, who are you? By Boaz. Ruth left empty, but returns full. And then this is flanked by the section of two of Naomi's relatives debate whether to support her. Here it's referring to the two daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth. And on the other side, two of Naomi's relatives, two men, debate whether to support her, Boaz and the unnamed kinsman redeemer. Both initially agree in both sections. In And the first one turns back when marriage is mentioned, and the same happens in the second. One chooses to stay with an admirable speech, and one chooses to help Ruth with her and Naomi with admirable speech. Blessing is uttered for Ruth in both, and the decision to support Naomi implies no marriage for Ruth in the first part, but in the second part, the decision to support Naomi results in marriage for Ruth. And then at the beginning, we have the introduction, the devastation of Naomi's family. Elimelech's line dies out, and Ruth's tragic marriage to the son, whose name means sick. And Naomi loses two sons. In the conclusion, it's the restoration of Naomi's and Elimelech's family. Ruth's blessed marriage to the man whose name means strength instead of sick. And Naomi promised many grandsons. Next, we have Ruth 1, calling this section Love's Resolve. At the end of Judges, an unfaithful Levite living in sin takes a woman as a concubine from Bethlehem. She is raped and killed by the Benjamites. In a symbolic way, the coming of Ruth, a Gentile, to Bethlehem is a righteous replacement for the lost woman in Judges 19 to 21. And Boaz, a half-breed, is a righteous replacement for the man of Bethlehem who sold his daughter as a concubine. And here in the story, we have a response to famine, although we don't know for certain. Given the evil in Israel at the time, it seems likely that the famine was God-ordained punishment. The decision by Elimelech to leave is a refusal to suffer punishment and to leave the land, a refusal of the Lord's covenant. This is ironic because it contradicts his name, which means God, Eli, is my king, Melech. He should have learned from the consequences of Abraham's flight to Egypt. Allowing his sons to marry Moabites was a violation of the law. Now, Naomi appears to passively obey her husband through this story, but that was her duty under the law. And what about Naomi's influence on Ruth? Ruth clings to Naomi. The Hebrew verb dabak means to stick like glue. I love that term. Her statement in Hebrew is even more beautiful than in English due to its alliterative and rhythmic nature. In the Hebrew, the words simply say, you go, I go. You live, I live. Your people, my people. Your God, my God. But here's how it sounds in Hebrew. Taleki ilek, talini alin, amak ami, wahoyak Elohe. Ruth exhibits wholehearted devotion to Naomi, giving her hesed, loving kindness, one of the key themes of the book. Why does Ruth follow Proverbs in the order of the Hebrew scriptures? Unlike our Christian Bible, Ruth appears following Proverbs in the Hebrew scriptures. Proverbs ends in chapter 31, 10 through 31, with a tribute to the righteous woman. In Hebrew, the Hayil Isah. Ruth illustrates a righteous woman. English Bibles place Ruth according to logical chronology. The Jews position the book thematically. Although Deuteronomy forbid the Moabite to join the congregation until the 10th generation, in one sense, Ruth is no longer a Moabite. She has become a proselyte of Judaism. And then we have this theme of fullness to emptiness and from pleasant to bitter. Naomi is not really empty. She has Ruth. Paradoxically, it is Ruth whom God uses to restore Naomi's faith. Ruth becomes the cure for emptiness and bitterness. I don't think Naomi is blaming the Lord for her plight, but does see him punishing the family for Elimelech's actions. Unlike Job, she does not express any confusion about why she is suffering, but she does lack hope of restoration. Jesus made himself empty so that we could be full. He endured bitterness like Naomi. I want you to see here the interesting parallels to the Judah Tamar story in Genesis 38. Like Elimelech, Judah leaves his family and sojourns with Canaanites, marrying one who dies. His first two sons die, both married to Tamar, whom he considers cursed. Like Ruth, Tamar clings to her Hebrew family, even though Judah refuses to allow the Levirate marriage of Tamar to his one remaining son. Like Ruth, Tamar proves to be more righteous than Judah. Both accounts involve Levirate marriage. Judah's second son dies because he refuses to redeem his brother's line by having a son by Tamar. He spills his seeds on the ground rather than make her pregnant. He stands in stark contrast to Boaz, and he is much like the closer relative who declines to redeem. Tamar and Ruth are both in the genealogy of David and Jesus. In accordance with the prohibition against foreigners in the congregation of Deuteronomy, the first king from the line of Judah, David, comes 10 generations after the Tamar Judah marriage. So the principle of Ruth 1 is, even in the darkest times, God is working to restore light to those who cling to him. And for application questions, when have you failed to endure punishment for sin like Elimelech? And when have you allowed bitterness to threaten your faith? Ruth, chapters 2 and 3, love's request and response. Boaz, a type of Christ, he shows loving kindness, as said, to his workers, and especially to Ruth, noticing her kindness to Naomi. Ruth literally responds, "You have noticed the unnoticed." Isn't this what Jesus did over and over? Throughout Scripture, God shows his hesed for widows, foreigners or sojourners, and orphans. Naomi and Ruth meet two of those three categories. Boaz fits the 10th generation pattern. From Noah to Abraham is 10 generations. From Abraham to Noah, 10 generations. And from Boaz is the 10th generation from Isaac. Now, why was Boaz not yet married? We are not given his age, but he praises Ruth for not seeking a young man, implying that he is older, presumably middle-aged. He would also have needed time to become as prosperous as he was. Perhaps he was shunned because of his connection to his mother Rahab, the uh, harlot from Jericho. The fact that he does not become a husband until God draws his bride to him points to Christ, the bridegroom, waiting for his bride, the church. Why does Naomi tell Ruth to change her clothes before submitting herself to Boaz? She likely was dressing like a widow in mourning, because she was. By removing her widow's clothes, she signals her availability for marriage. This makes more sense than wearing something fancy that would imply that she was appealing to Boaz's sexual desires. Why is Boaz willing to marry a Moabitess? Well, his mother Rahab was a Gentile. And it's possible he was rejected by full-blooded Israelite women. We can also see here parallels to the story of Lot. Lot's daughters-in-law lose their husbands like Ruth and Orpah, and Ruth's uncovering of Boaz's feet is like Lot's daughters-in-law uncover him, but unlike them, Ruth is righteous. She does not get Boaz drunk and take advantage of him. The other connection is that Ruth is a descendant of Lot. Boaz. Now, he must have already been thinking about marrying Ruth to redeem Elimelech's inheritance, because when she presents herself, he already has figured out that there's another man who has first dibs due to closer family relationship. Like Christ, Boaz is willing to risk criticism to redeem, to be the Goel, the kinsman redeemer. The related Hebrew word to Goel is simply a change in vowel, Goal. Remember that written Hebrew has only consonants and the vowels are implied. Goal is the kinsman avenger. Jesus came the first time as the Goel, but he will return as the Goal or Goal. Boaz is type of Christ. Boaz gives Ruth grain, and Jesus said, I am the bread of life, and water, I am the living water. So the principle here is God's loving kindness redeems his chosen. Redemption always comes with a cost. I like this story of the little boy who built a boat from scratch and attached a rope to it and put it out in the river to see it float. But he got it too far out into the current, and the string broke, and the boat started moving down the river. The boy tried to follow it from the shoreline, but he couldn't keep up, and the boat disappeared down the river. He was so sad. Several weeks go by, and on his way home from school, he passes a pawn shop. And there in the window, lo and behold, is his boat. So he eagerly enters the store and asks the proprietor if he can have his boat back. And the proprietor says, well, I would love to give it to you back, but I paid money for it. If you just pay me what I paid for it, you can have it back. So he ran home and told his mother, and she gave him some extra chores to do, and he earned the money to go and buy back his boat. And when he was taking it home, he looked at his boat and he said, I have redeemed you. I made you and I bought you back. Because you can only redeem what you previously owned. And that is the beauty of Christ in redemption. Ruth 4, Love's Reward. Boaz expertly sets up his fellow kinsman who has priority to be the redeemer of Naomi. He entices him with the land and then reveals that since Naomi is too old to conceive, he would have to marry Ruth. Now, let me interject here that there is an alternative translation of the Hebrew in this section. It's possible that the text actually says, or that Boaz actually says, that if you redeem the land, that I, Boaz, will marry Ruth. The implication of that is that, yes, you can buy the land and you can use it for a while, but if I marry Ruth and we have a son, then the son is going to inherit the land. He won't have to buy it, which means that the other relative would be potentially wasting his money because there was no written Levirate rule that required a more distant relative than a brother to redeem, and also to marry the daughter-in-law. He was required to marry Naomi. He wasn't required to marry Ruth, not by the strict law. Also, he's presumably already married with sons and does not want a son by Ruth to potentially compete with his sons over inheritance. Now, the reference for taking off his shoe is Deuteronomy 25:9. If he had not taken it off himself and had refused to redeem, and Boaz was not willing to step in either, Naomi would be authorized by the law to come and confront this closest relative in front of the leaders of the town and remove his sandal from his foot and spit in his face in the presence of leaders at the gate. It was a public humiliation. So by removing his shoe himself, he's basically saying, okay, well, I don't want Naomi to come here and do this and spit in my face. So I'll just remove my shoe and turn over the responsibility to you, Boaz. Also, the spit was symbolic of his seed, his semen. By spitting in his face, he's saying to him, your seed shall return to you void, that is, without children. Boaz is type of Christ as kinsman redeemer. The redeemer had to be, number one, related. So Christ had to be fully human. He had to be able. Only Christ as the perfect man could redeem all mankind from sin, and he had to be willing. Only God himself was capable of this act of sacrificial love. Other types of the story that Ruth is thought by many to be a type of the church, because she is a Gentile who in faith comes to Christ and will draw the Jews back. Naomi is a type of the dispersed Jews, some of whom are brought to Christ by Gentile believers. Boaz also acts as an intercessor for Naomi and Ruth, as Christ acts as the intercessor for us. Hebrews 7:25. Consequently, he is able to save to the uttermost those who draw near to him through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. The blessings. The women blessed Naomi to be like Rachel, Leah, and Tamar, which clearly indicates the connection to Genesis 38. Rachel and Leah were the mothers of 8 of the 12 tribes. We saw earlier the connection to Tamar, and like Ruth, a Gentile, Tamar is honored as the mother of Boaz. Now, in terms of God being invisible in this book, I refer you to Secret Codes from Dr. Chuck Missler's book, Cosmic Codes. Some people believe that there are secret messages encoded in the Bible, some which are based on intervals of numbers. Letters appearing at X intervals are found to spell hidden words. While there are 5 names that appear at 49 letter intervals, 49 of course being 7 times 7, in Genesis 38. And they appear in this order: Boaz, Ruth, Obed, Jesse, David. The genealogy in order. That's kind of spooky. But if you like this sort of thing, Cosmic Codes is a great book to explore this further. And then there's the blessing, may he be famous throughout Israel, that it refers reference to Boaz. It's interesting that the temple pillars of Solomon's temple had 2 decorative pillars in front. They were not functional. They didn't hold up the roof. These were named Jachin and Boaz. Jachin means Yahweh establishes, and Boaz means strength. So together, Yahweh establishes strength. Throughout Ruth, we see God working behind the scenes. He is invisible in that he does not speak directly or through a prophet. Were Boaz and Ruth the dream couple? Well, Ruth is never described as being beautiful. Boaz is not described as handsome. They are not socially or culturally equal. What did they have in common? Both were praised for their character. Both loved God and saw God working in their relationship, and they let God be their matchmaker. If you're single, how willing are you to let God be your matchmaker or submit to God's will regarding your singleness? Principle here is Christ humbled himself as a man in order to be our kinsman redeemer. Christ was willing to lower himself from heaven to earth, from divine to human, sacrificing himself to redeem us from sin. Will you personally accept his sacrifice and abide with him? Will you allow yourself to be redeemed? Ruth and Boaz find rest by letting God guide their relationship. They don't seek to make their own story. Unlike the movie character Jerry Maguire, Boaz does not think that Ruth completes him, nor vice versa. They submit to God and allow him to use them in his story. To what extent are you living your story and expecting God to validate it? How are you seeking to redeem yourself without God? So, in closing prayer or prayer wish, combining the key Hebrew words Tabak, Goel, and Hesed, may we, Lord, stick like glue, Tabak, to our Redeemer, our Goel, abiding in his loving kindness, his Hesed. And that's my prayer for all of us this week. So thanks for watching. Please click on subscribe, like, or share with a friend. And remember, PDFs available at BibleMining.org. And you can also email us privately at info@BibleMining.org. Thanks again. Have a blessed week. Next week, we move on to Samuel.